Wonderful. Eric, you ready to roll, my friend?
Let's bring it.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be on with you. Seeing some familiar faces and names on the screen, and also seeing some new ones and others that I have not met, but I've heard a lot about. So glad that you are on with us. And like all of us in this new virtual world, if you see two little kids run behind me or you hear screaming, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to take it that they're okay. So thanks for your patience there. Appreciate it. A little bit about KnowledgeWorks. I have my colleague and friend, Eric, who's joining us here, and some other colleagues that are on listening as well. But Eric and I will talk to you. Well, we'll save that for a bit. But who first is KnowledgeWorks? We're actually an operating foundation out of Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. And a lot of our work is centered around personalized and competency-based learning. We actually got there through our work from our strategic foresight team. In every 3 years, we put out a future forecast that explores the future of the world and the implications on our learning infrastructure and ecosystem. And that, I believe it was the second forecast where there was a topic around radical personalization. And since that forecast as an organization, we have been hyper-focused on supporting systems, local, regional, and statewide, and making that vision of personalization a reality. And we do so in a number of ways, supporting on the practice end with educators on the ground, also on the policy end, collaborating with policymakers and state departments of ed, as well as the U.S. Department of Ed, and thinking through what are the policy flexibilities and conditions that might inspire and empower the vision for personalization and competency to thrive. And also the work that Eric and team lead in terms of what does that research say and how do we measure that impact and how do we produce that? So a little bit about Eric and I. On the next slide, I'm the Chief Learning Officer, which is for me just a fancy way of saying I get to learn from some pretty incredible, amazing educators and communities across the country. Eric?
Hey everyone, good morning or afternoon, wherever you may be. I think mostly morning for everyone. My name is Eric Toshalis. I am Senior Director in the Impact and Improvement Division at KnowledgeWorks, where I lead the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative, the Remix Project, the Students at the Center Distinguished Fellowship, and essentially get to do a lot of what Virgil does, which is learn from lots of cool people in the field about where the edges are and try to explore those edges and produce more equity. And to that end, I think it's good to know just sort of a little bit about our approach. In today's paper, or today's presentation, we're focusing on how the de-tracking movement and how the de-tracking strategy could be infused within our work within the competency-based education field. And that connects really well with what we do at KnowledgeWorks in the impact and improvement field, which is focusing on uncovering the practices and supports and services that provide the most equitable and highest quality education for each learner. We collect data and we create the insights that allow for us to shift and dismantle and rebuild systems so they're more equitable and responsive. And we're actively engaged in democratizing research so that the process remains owned by and accountable to those who are ultimately most impacted by our decisions and the things that we build. That's our jam. But today we'd like to start out with a poll.
Right, so Autumn, our friend here from Aurora, will help us out with the poll. So who are you? What is your role? And that'll help us to better understand or to provide you with some examples that perhaps relate directly to your role. If you don't mind taking a few seconds to take that poll. And then as we, just for the second question and bullet, we'll have more of this conversation in a breakout session here momentarily, but if you could start to think about your experience with tracking as a learner, perhaps something you're considering as an educator, whether an internal struggle or one that you've had publicly that you're tackling currently. So if you can have that, just start to contemplate and think about that. And it looks like we have a mixture here. We have school and district administrators, classroom teachers. Good to see a state education person, state department person, and some nonprofit leaders, and always kudos to the researchers.
Also great to see that folks who have benefited from tracking are not deciding to want to keep it. We'll get into why that's a good call here in a moment, but also folks who are recognizing their positionality and benefiting, but also want to try to work to change it or are concerned about some of its effects. And then of course, folks who were oppressed and excluded by tracking, who are looking for some remedies here. So we've got a little bit over 2/3 of folks who voted. So my suggestion would be that we jump into the next piece and close out the poll, unless you want to give another 30 seconds there, Virgil.
Nope, and sorry, Roman, I saw your commentary there. I was trying to type and hit enter too soon. It works. It allowed me to scroll up after a few seconds, so hopefully you have that opportunity. If not, we'll have the conversation in a breakout.
And Eric and Virgil, I didn't see the results of the poll. Is there a share results button at the bottom?
There it is.
You go. Okay, now we can see it.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Great.
Awesome. So to start out the day here, we want to begin with essentially 4 core observations that will help us to just kind of establish a few insights that drive our work in KnowledgeWorks and in the impact and improvement team in which we use competency-based education as an equity strategy. And essentially, this is sort of looking out across the field. This is what we see and what we know. And we expect to engage you in conversation about this right after. So first one is essentially this, and it doesn't surprise anyone. It's the oft-cited Carnegie and Cameron claim that systems are perfectly designed to yield the outputs that they produce. So if you want to change the outputs, you've got to change the design. It's no accident that our schools, and despite the fact that we're continuing to bemoan a lot of our equity problems in schools and systems, some of those are because that's the way we intended it. So we got to change some of those designs to get to those things. The next piece goes through the fact that the practice and policy of labeling and ranking and sorting students into track classes has been demonstrated time and again over many decades now to drive some of the most glaring inequities and opportunity gaps of our schools. And the research about the effects of tracking is also widely established and also in many ways widely known. But despite being amply discredited and widely resisted, tracking remains widespread across our schools and systems in all 50 states. So there's no shortage of ink that's spilled on these observations, but there's really no real arguments to retain tracking that haven't been disproven. It's really a question of our systemic will and our commitments, not a question of proof anymore. And there's a recent article by Paul Gorski who suggests that even our trauma-informed education cannot live where hyper-punitive ideologies and institutional cultures are allowed to live. Literally, some of the biggest sources of trauma that our students experience come from how they're treated in our schools. And the shorthand on that one is telling someone that they're dumb actually produces harm. And what we're trying to do is to create systems that don't tell kids that they're dumb. Wouldn't that be great? Next one.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And it's, you know, as humans, I think it's easy for us to identify pieces that are bad in our world, right? Just naturally innate in all of us. But the piece I love most about educators is that we're able to think through different alternatives, and we must provide those alternatives that allow us to dismantle those old systems and help us to think about new ones that help kids to thrive. And like many of you in this session that I know and I've heard a lot of about you personally or the learning communities in which you serve, you're starting to think, educators are starting to think about swapping out some of these harmful approaches with others that are about giving justice and producing equity and enhancing rigor. And but the key though is how do we do this and how do we implement those? And that's really where we test our fortitude to our commitment to our vision as educators. Advance to the next one there, please, Eric. And as, again, just looking at the faces and the names represented here today, those of you that are participating with us and joining us, it turns out that we already have a system that is doing just that, right? That is taking away that tracking mentality. And schools, states, districts are already starting to think about how we could produce strong outcomes and greater equity, challenging the foundation of tracking through competency education in hyper-personalized ways. And for us at KnowledgeWorks, as you heard in our introduction, we call personalized competency-based learning. Today's session is designed to help us establish that foundation for using PCBL as an equity catalyst, and learning from you also about what steps you are taking. But speaking of that, we want to take the time, we'll take a few minutes in a breakout session just to hear what you're thinking currently, what's on your mind, what's challenging you. So what rationale have you heard from retaining tracking systems in our schools? And perhaps what is a step that you've taken yourself? And we only have 5 minutes, so we're going to try to get as many voices in these breakout sessions as possible. So Eric or I will join you in one of the sessions. Autumn, thanks for hooking us up in a breakout. And thanks for joining. You should see the invite down below to join a breakout room. See you there. At least I used to.
Not seeing the breakout yet there. Autumn, is it coming?
Yeah, we have a couple of people who are joining breakout sessions right now. Eric, we have 2 in yours.
Oh,
Great.
I didn't get that invite, Autumn. How do I do that? Sorry, Rita is telling us you can click on more and go to breakouts. I'm not seeing more though.
If you click on the number of participants next to your names, it says join.
Oh, thank you, Roman. I think that was you. Appreciate it. So you go to breakout rooms, click on the number, and we will join you there. Thank you for that.
Hi, Autumn. It's Melissa. Don't see where for breakout rooms. I don't see that.
So it should be at the bottom of your screen. When you kind of hover towards the bottom, there should be a portion that says breakout rooms. Do you not see that?
No, I just see record, reactions, share screen, chat, participants.
Okay, so that might be because you have sort of an older version of Zoom.
Okay.
It updated really late, like 2 nights ago. So that might just unfortunately be
No
the
worries.
problem. Yeah,
No
I
worries.
apologize.
No, not a problem. I'll hang out here for a little bit. And I'll know to do that. That's a good point in terms of just having to upgrade then. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'm in the same boat. I can't find a way of finding anything.
Me too, because I am on my phone for other reasons. Hey, Alan, whoever's in here, we can talk about tracking if you want without a moderator. But yes, Crystal, we can be our own breakout. So yeah, I'm curious about, especially people who are school-based or district-based, what have the conversations about tracking been or not been? Do you still have it? In what forms? And where are you at? I would love to hear what people think.
Hey, Lori, this is Kathy Cotton. How are you doing?
Hey, Kathy. Good.
Something that comes up in conversation quite often here would be, what is the difference between tracking and personalized learning in some situations? Because we are we've gone from competency-based and now our focus has been on personalized, supported by competency-based education, and we're going through that transition. with keeping this in mind, that we don't want to get into a tracking situation using data, using all of the input that we have, and separating students even more. So I think that's our struggle here with a lot of teachers.
I think for me, this is really about calling out what has been the linchpin for tracking, which is how we've reduced the measuring of students to track them to scores on particular kinds of narrow-based tests in 2 subject areas, which obviously does not bring the whole strengths-based and asset-based approach of what all a person brings to the learning and growth and development equation. And so if we personalize, and we're personalizing for our students or to our students versus with and have it come from our students, we're also, I think, falling prey to the same things. For me, and that's why I say personalize, bringing the person, their voice, their choice, their agency, their ability to make a difference and have a say in their own learning is the highlight of personalization. And if we instead just still find another way to narrowly sort people in a different way, then that's really not that different, I think, than tracking. But I think we've got to call out both the purpose of what we are doing in terms of growing a whole person, as well as how we've reduced that to something that could be tracked or personalized in a negative sense. And if we don't do that, then we run the risk of doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and Kathy, I think that I imagine that is a conversation at a lot of places. And how do we differentiate and allow students to go deeper and further if they're able, but without doing it in a track system? So that's like where it's personalized and there's options. That doesn't have to be done in a separate track, right? So I think that is the key to is to not recreate this track system, but to personalize in other spaces, as opposed to saying you're going to be in the honors class and we're going to personalize and you're going to go where you're going to go. And we're going to make sure that everyone gets to a minimum to our sort of, our minimum high expectations, right?
Yeah, I love that. But again, it's the consistent communication around that. And a lot of teachers come up with great arguments. They're saying, hey, that might be a, course tracking, but within the classroom, you start that. And it's a culture that we're trying to move beyond. And I love what both of you have said. Again, it's like, I would love to see more put out around this, because I think it's something that we unexpectedly ran into.
This is Aaron from Idaho. I know a recent district who opened up, and the kids get to choose which courses they want, and they can choose to join an accelerated class if they want to, which is maybe a stepping stone in that direction. So students get in there and they may not have ever had an accelerated course before and have to stretch a little bit, but the opportunity is available for any student to join any class. Which is kind of a cool thing. And then within that class, teacher has to recognize that some of the skills are more developing than others, but it's a stepping stone, maybe a place to transition.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, especially if you can think of how can the accelerated not just be going through the same material faster, but can we think about it as maybe that's an optional add-on where you go deeper, right? And you explore something that sparks your interest that you want to further engage in inquiry around, as opposed to saying, oh, this group, you're accelerated, you're going faster, right? There's a different frame and different culture around those things.
This is Melissa. It's nice to hear all of you. Thank you for sharing. I think that our struggle in this process, which I'm sure is a common struggle perhaps, right, is the the argument around, okay, so what do we do with the students who are, how does this benefit if we don't track, how does this benefit the students who are demonstrating mastery and may feel stuck? And I think it goes to, something that the facilitators alluded to earlier, which is that then there's an issue with the design, like the overall design of the school and the program and all of that. But I'm just wondering what you all, like your thoughts are on that in terms of how do we counter what evidence is there in terms of the students who are ready to move on, let's say, and are often ready to move on for many different reasons. And yeah, and so then what do we do about that?
Eric, you're muted.
Oh, we were all muted. Sorry about that. Hello. We're back. I was doing the same thing. I was talking to you, Eric, and you couldn't hear me. So we're back. And there is an idea that came up in our breakout session. There was some really great commentary and questions that were shared in ours that inspired perhaps some connections for others to connect one another post this piece. So if you don't mind and you're willing to share your Twitter handle or social connection or even your email address for others to connect with you, please do so in the chat. We appreciate your insights. And we'll do that one other time in this session. Eric, any big ideas that came out of your group?
Huge federal mandates drive a lot of this stuff with RTI programs that create pullouts and stigmatize kids that are very deficit based. How do you manage that? Second question would be when you have university systems like in California and in other states that require certain course levels and mandates in order to get admission, how do you not create tracking that moves toward that in some way? Really good questions about then transcript reform and trying to create things like profiles of a graduate as a strategy there, but really important structural questions. How about you, Virgil?
Yeah, there were some really great insights. You know what? It's just easier to do it this way, right? That's like a simple answer. It's just easier, right? It's just kind of built in and ingrained. I recall when I moved to the country, the whole idea that I, as a young guy, wanted to be part of the Bluebirds group. Always, never made it, but wanted to be, right? And this whole idea that a concluding thought that a lot of ideas for why not to do it, but a concluding thought as to why we do it. Oftentimes it's ingrained in who we are as learners, right? It's just kind of built in so much into our system that it's hard to overcome that.
Yeah. That's a great segue to the next point, which is really looking at some of the core reasons about why we should still push for detracking. What is some of the core evidence about that? Even though it may be easier for many of us, it may be easier for systems because that's the way they're hardwired. Why should we do it anyway? One of the main conclusions from the field is that tracking is inherently unfair. It plays a huge role in the creation and maintenance of inequity, of oppression, and of supremacy in our society, not just in our schools, but in our communities. The criteria that schools and communities use to make decisions about when and where to track students have been shown multiple times to be highly subjective. Teacher recommendation, tests that are superly culturally biased. They're demonstrably biased and often racist and classist and ableist. They're discriminatory both in their intention and in their impact. Those kids get this kind of education. Those other kids get that kind of education. And dependent on long disproven notions of human intelligence that we now know with the many last decades of investigation in brain plasticity just don't hold up to scrutiny anymore. So it's bad science that produces inequitable outcomes is the way to sum up this slide.
Yeah, and this next one actually came up a lot in our breakout session. So our team hit it out of the park here, but the reality is that labels stick, right? And we as educators and leaders, we use them, and unfortunately students and families internalize them. But the piece that we've seen a lot in the PCBL movement is this whole idea of pace, and the reality is that temporary changes in pacing have nothing to do with capacity. So each of us slows down and speeds up and it's dependent on the activities and also on particular days, right? Certain contextual factors, far outside learners' internal ability. So tying capacity to pacing, really we need to think about that as malpractice, and it takes effort out of the equation, and it does harm to the learner's sense of self-efficacy, which we talk a lot about as educators, and their possibilities that they want to pursue as they continue to grow and learn and expand.
Yeah, and building on that, we know that tracking has a disproportionately negative impact on already underserved and vulnerable populations of students. So if we're looking at equity concerns, this is a glaring red flag. Lower track students are deprived of opportunity, they're deprived of enrichment, they're deprived of rigor and challenge, and tracking functions as what many researchers have called a technology of segregation that limits potential and forecloses achievement. And for those who are relegated to the lowest tracks, even though we may call them college prep, it can often be quite demoralizing and demotivating. And we're seeing that a lot right now in the COVID era with remote learning, with teacher after teacher, school after school, and district after district that's saying, my kids aren't submitting work right now. They just aren't doing it. They're not motivated. And the reasons many kids are not motivated is because why should they try when they know that their grade will stay the way that it was, and the motivation to publicly fail just isn't there anymore. They need something to sink their teeth into that provides opportunity for growth and for learning over time. So our gaps in opportunity and access across the K-12 experience typically grow. Kindergartners who start at this level, by the time they're seniors and are graduating, the gaps and differences and opportunities and how far apart those various subgroups are grow over time. And what we should think about if we want schools is that those things should be being reduced over time. We should make schools as the great equalizer. With tracking, it's really hard to claim that schools are the great equalizer.
And this one gets me, so forgive me if I get, and those of you that know me, I tend to get a little passionate and emotional about certain topics, especially when it comes to kids and learners. And I also say too, please know we want to give time for folks to add commentary and provide some insights. So that's why we're probably talking a little faster than we'd like to as well. And thank you for sharing your contact information and your social media handles as well. So lots of great, amazing leaders on this call. So grateful that you're all here. So kind of just to focus on the slide here, and know that I'm going to insert some language that just gets me at the gut because it fundamentally flies against what I believe many of you and definitely I believe. So I'm going to put some air quotes in here, which as a former English teacher, I loathe, but here we go. So just thinking about this here is, and tracking, it's really not just about, again, air quote, the lower track students who are harmed, right? We've seen tons and tons of research that demonstrates that, air quotes again, higher track students also lose out on core opportunities to broaden their perspectives and to learn to work across differences. Right? One of the key skill sets that we know employers and colleges relish in their stakeholders. And also, tracks also teach over-resourced students, really nice ways of, I'm gonna bite my tongue a little bit. So tracks also teach over-resourced students that their position and rank is a result of merit, when oftentimes through tracking, it's more about the outcome of privilege, segregation, and resource hoarding. And that happens. And I can go into a number of personal stories, again, going back to that Bluebird group analogy that still hits me in the gut to this day. But I won't save that for the social hour later.
And folks, we aren't blazing trails here. We're also not alone in this work. The CBE field is in many ways a bit far behind many leading organizations who have already made clear statements against tracking and have suggested the need to detrack as soon as possible. And in this way, detracking might be more of a movement for us to join than an initiative we feel like we have to lead. And I, for one, find a lot of hope in that, because You can see this is a partial list and it's always growing. These are some pretty heavy hitters here of folks who've said, hey folks, the tracking thing is pretty obviously bad. We really have to commit to finding ways to reproduce, to dismantle it and put better things in place. And these are the drivers of a lot of our best pedagogy, a lot of our best assessment strategies. And in some ways, in some cases, these are some of the organizations who have been more on the moderate end and have been loath to try to step out in front. But yet here they are stepping out in front on the tracking issue. So again, we're not blazing a trail here. We're not alone. There's a lot we can join up. There's a lot of movement we could be part of here. Psyched about that. So that brings us to the big question. Yeah, but we're kind of in a crazy situation right now with the pandemic and I don't know, an election next week and everything else. Is this really the time to be doing this? Should we really step out and make these sort of moves? And I think we have to recognize that we may need to wait on some moves here and there for things to settle. But if we're constantly giving credence to the argument that now is not the time, then now will never be the time. So what can we achieve now incrementally, and what are some of the big moves we can prepare for later as we're continuing to do the maintenance work of keeping our systems as healthy as they can be for our most marginalized? So how can we keep those questions live is essentially that. And the opportunity, I think, really is right now. There are many educators, leaders, and parents who are already bemoaning the ongoing and rather visible damage that's done by tracking. The inequity is obvious, and the events of 2020 have really heightened our attention to this. Tracking's not helping us to get to equity when there are multiple communities who have been clamoring for it for decades, if not centuries. So we need to help systems detox from the school designs that will help them depart from the separate and accelerated opportunities for the so-called gifted students. For example, like what young person do you know that doesn't have a gift, by the way? To bestow that particular label on some and not others does actual harm in schools. And then how do we get people to remove themselves from isolated and remediated instructional strategies for the struggling learners? Who among us has ever not struggled when we've tried to learn something new? Why are we pathologizing struggle? Struggle is something we should be lifting up. That's what it looks like to be at the edge of your possibility and capabilities. So in many ways, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to challenge the assumptions upon which the wheel was already built. And then we need to recognize that schools don't need to track once they have rigorous and important and well-designed CBE systems. And we see that time and time again, that you go into schools that have done that, the logic for tracking sort of falls away. And that's what we want out of some of this, this confluence of CBE and detracking. So let's talk. Same thing, different question this time. How might detracking accelerate and enrich learning for students that you know? And I want to make this as personal as possible. This isn't a theoretical discussion. I want you to think about a student that you know well, might be your own kid. How might detracking accelerate and enrich learning for them? And the reason I'm posing this question, the reason Virgil and I are posing the question this way is it gets behind the logic that says that if we detrack, we'll be de-accelerating and taking away enrichment from some of our learners. And what we're trying to argue is to flip that script a bit. How might it actually accelerate and enrich learning for students that you know? So think about that one student and we'll talk for 5 minutes and we'll come right back.
And Eric, if I can pose another piece too, as you join the breakouts, it came out in another breakout session. For those of us that are exploring mastery in our systems now, are we doing some semblance of tracking now in that current paradigm as well? And if so, what does that look like? And is that as harmful at all? Things to consider. So thanks for joining those breakouts. Again, if you click on breakout rooms at the bottom and select either Virgil or Eric, we will go there. Thanks all.
All right, welcome back, everyone.
So we learned, Eric, to unmute ourselves when we come back. So that's great. We can get rolling. Some insights that were shared from your group, Eric.
Fantastic historical recognition of the way that from Meg at the Mastery Collaborative in New York pointed out that the move to integrate schools, that's when tracking was invented in order to sustain the same segregating structures within integrated schools that existed with segregated schools. So it's an important historical note there. And then just thinking about how labels function in school, particularly for the way that kids receive encouragements and the way that some kids receive, like, you're not ready for this, and what that does to life possibilities. Those are not subtle messages. Those are deeply, deeply felt messages that have material effects on people's lives. So important to note that. How about you, Virgil?
Yeah, I love those. Awesome. So some really great, powerful personal stories that were shared. Really appreciated our folks for doing that. A piece that really stood out, in addition to those powerful stories, Alan referenced the idea that it's a contemplation for us to consider, that the idea that you remove the detracking strategies or you remove the tracking strategies to put in detracking strategies does not necessarily mean we're always doing what's best for kids and their development as human beings. Really resonated in multiple snaps of fingers and helping us to think about, just because that's very common in us as educators, right? To think that we have this next great strategy that'll move the entire piece forward. So it's actually a great transition to helping us in conclude the rest of the presentation, which is, so what are those other elements? What are those other pieces that Alan is referencing that'll help us, or that personalized competency-based learning helps us replace that those tracking mechanisms, those systems, that culture that exists throughout our education paradigm that many of you are dismantling or replacing and innovating now. So we just continue on there. Eric, you're up, my friend.
Yeah, so what we'll see here is a series of slides that are going to compare the way that tracking has created infrastructure, ideologies, particular practices and assumptions with CBE on the side. And this one is kind of restating some of the origins that we see from tracking. Tracking, it's built on a eugenics model, the old bell curve, racism, classism, notions of intelligence, all the bad stuff that we don't want to be doing if we're moving toward equity. CBE's research basis is based on a whole host of well-identified big drivers in achievement, in social emotional learning, in culturally responsive education, and ethnic and racial identity development, and post-secondary successes. So if we're looking at trying to just say which has the research base behind it, you're not going to find much that's worth defending for tracking, and you're going to find a whole host of rad stuff on the CBE side.
Then you look at the more traditional piece where that Bluebird's group continues to exist. It thrives on assumptions that have already been disproven in a number of different ways, right? Versus in our PCBL, our personalized competency-based environments, is really based on this idea that we know what we already know to be true about how humans learn best. And that this whole idea that it never stops, right? That learning never stops, and it's not place-based either, necessarily place-based within the confines of our school walls.
Nice. Yeah, and man, you folks, you've all done this. You've walked into a school, you hear everyone talk a blue streak about their growth mindsets, and there's posters on the wall and all the nice encouragements, and then you look at the tracking that exists in that school, and you just can't make the argument that detracked schools exhibit, or that tracked school or tracked learning environments exhibit a growth mindset, because they just don't. What they're saying is your ability is fixed, you're stuck within a fixed notion of your intelligence, and that your growth is going to be limited by how much you have there. Whereas in CBE, it's like, here's the standard. How do you want to demonstrate it? You can get to it, or you can get further beyond it if you want to, but you've got to get to this level. Here are the 6,000 different ways we can help you to get to that point. And it changes the nature of how we talk about mindsets, and it provides an actual evidence for learners that we mean what we say, and that we're matching it with our actions on a daily basis and the structures we use to create instructional opportunities.
And before I share out here, Ruth, thank you for sharing the journey there in the chat. And if you have any resources that are available to the team, please feel free to post that link. And we're all learning here and excited to learn from those that are on the journey. So huge high five and kudos to you and your learning community for the work that you're doing. Look forward to learning more. I hadn't heard your story just yet. So a big piece that we talk a lot about again in education, you know, we create these pathways. We talk a lot about pathways. So what do those pathways mean? I think many of you, my good friend Robin that's on the call, we talk about pathways a ton, but if we're talking about pathways that are linear and fixed, then we're doing it wrong, right? So if what we need to start thinking about is how do we create these really rich pathways that are not necessarily set in stone, but allow kids to advance based on mastery and competency, but also allow kids to flex and pursue other pathways and other journeys and demonstrate their evidence of learning in ways that are meaningful to each one of them that might not necessarily be specific to that particular pathway. Right. So, so how do we create those opportunities? How do we redesign our systems to allow that to occur?
So the big question in CBE often is just like the mindsets that are required to change about how we assess. What is the purpose of assessment? Why do we even do it? Tracking confers a whole logic about what assessment is for. And in general, at the systemic level, this may not be at the classroom level, but at the systemic level, assessment is often used, not always, but is often used for ranking and sorting. It is not that purpose in CBE. Assessment is used for learning, and it's not to capture learning, it's for learning. The differences between formative and summative and all of the feedback loops that we create and the opportunities to redo and retake assessments in order to constantly be moving forward, completely different MO on the CBE side than the tracking side. And in the environments that I've been into that have really strong, rigorous implementations of CBE, you can hear it in the way the students talk about their work and why they're doing it and why they're trying harder, because they're not scared about the label they're going to get. They want to get better. Completely different purpose of assessment that has very different social, emotional, and life trajectory effects.
Yeah, building on that, Eric, exactly right. What we want to make sure is that kids aren't already building in this perceived notion of what their abilities might be. How often have we encountered as educators that learner that says, I'm not that kind of student, right? Because we have done wrong along the way where we've built these limitations already in them, where they believe that is their perception, which is their reality, right? So how do we create new systems that ensures that we're supporting kids in reaching mastery in highly personalized ways that ensure that they're ready to tackle the rigors of that next step, whatever that next step might be for them? And what does that look like? I appreciate, Elliot, you posting the Delago journey. And when Elliot posts about learning communities, what we learn is that many communities across the country are doing just that, building those structures that allow kids to advance and are not necessarily thinking about where I am on the continuum currently, but how am I learning in deeper, more enriching and authentic ways that help me to drive to greater levels of learning, but in ways that are meaningful for myself as I am advancing through the continuum.
Nice. Man, we've trained generations of students to be grade grubbing praise junkies. And, you know, they're obsessed with scores and points and letters, not growth, not competency, not mastery, not proficiency, not lifelong learning, not collegiality, not justice. You know, grades are how we levy judgment of work, but they're entirely invalid and reliable at the systems level. And in tracked contexts, they function as judgments of people, right? So grades and tracking regimes tend to be most accurate as predictors of socioeconomic status and compliance behaviors. And I was at a meeting at Microsoft a year or two ago. Actually, it was probably only 9 or 10 months ago, but it feels like 20 years ago, where one of the chief leaders in their innovation side of the shop there was saying like, oh, we love your valedictorians. They make perfect middle managers for us because they know how to turn in stuff on time. They know how to submit things that are spell checked. They get things done. They're super great. But when you want the champions of our industry and the people who are innovating and trying new things and know how to work and explore the edges of stuff, we want your people people that kind of phoned it in on some of the classes they hated, nailed the ones that they did, decided where to allocate energies and pressures, and maybe got into some trouble here and there. Those are not your valedictorians. And it was an eye opener for everyone in the room who has been thinking about like, oh, we just have to make sure that all of our kids succeed at the highest levels. Maybe, yes, what we need to make sure is our kids are able to demonstrate competency and they know how to show their work, and that they use grades not as a motivation because they're afraid of being judged, but grades are actually assessments of what they're capable of doing, and they demonstrate outside the schools the competencies that people have grown to possess. That's what we want.
So Eric, we only have 10 minutes. Let's see if we can synthesize each slide in one sentence. How about that?
I love it.
We have some time for Q&A as well. Let's see if we can do it. So this piece essentially, the reality is our current paradigm is oftentimes built on that bell curve where some do and some can't, so to speak. So how do we ensure that that all learners are able to achieve at those deep, rich levels so that they can all, so they all thrive in ways that are motivating to each one of them?
This one's you too.
Oh, geez. Okay. So I'll just speak to this in terms of pathways as well, right? So spoke about it earlier. So how do we ensure we don't create ruts, but rather routes that that allow kids to move through our paradigm in ways that, again, inspiring and motivating to each one of them?
Yeah, and this next one is really just a way to look at the core moves that are required. And they're very different. You have to really change the way that people think about what their work looks like and where it's pointed. And what their works looks like and where it's pointed in CBE systems, if you talk to students and teachers who've done it, it's so much more rewarding. They no longer feel like they're part of a cog in a machine. They feel like they're making things happen for their community. And infrastructure, this one's me too. And look at the stuff we've built. Look at all of the things we have to maintain and sustain in order to keep tracking in. It's not like it's just like an idea, it's the bricks and mortar. And then look at all the awesome things off to the right that can replace the things that are on the left side of the screen that are more life affirming, that are liberative, that are motivating and engaging for students and communities to think about how to be better and grow and become ready for post-secondary success and living in a community.
So what might we do about it? So what can we do about it now? What are some steps that you can take a look at as leaders within your learning communities? What might be some steps you can do? So we'll try to do it all in one sentence, and this slide deck and presentation will be available to you. And thank you to everyone who is sharing resources that you've locally designed as well. So grateful and appreciative of you. Eric, next slide. So a big piece, a good friend that's actually on, I believe, or I saw earlier, Teresa Ewald, actually talks a lot about coherence mapping. So if this is a commitment of yours, what are some policies or structures that currently exist within your system that you need to evaluate and audit to think about if it aligns with that, that vision or paradigm you aspire to achieve? What flies in the face of that? What needs to be removed? And was just shared in the box. I saw it really quickly. Robin, awesome. What are those load-bearing walls that need to be replaced with something else, right? So the beauty of a load-bearing wall analogy is you can't just take it away without replacing it with something else.
Nice, love that load-bearing wall. So an item here is to scan your system and your school and your partnerships to look at different ways that your guidelines, your deficit discourses, strained logics, and specious claims about some kids versus other kids might be challenged. Develop a look for list that you can use that's approachable and useful for the folks that you're having operationalize this work, and walkthrough tools so anyone can skim a document or a setting and check for that tracking residue that's still in the way we understand pathways and pacing and ability and remediation and pull-out programs in a struggling learner. To me, those key terms that are at the bottom of this slide are ones that are often legitimizing the way that people can continue to use tracking systems within personalized competency-based learning structures. And we need to challenge the way that those terms are often given tacit approval for that. So do those scans, challenge the way those words are being used.
And as leaders, it's going to challenge us as leaders to think differently about how we support this transformation, right? So oftentimes, you know, as humans, when things get tough, we tend to retreat. and leaders do that as well. So how can you fly in the face of that, tackle that head on, address concerns, involve and include others who perhaps want to challenge and maintain the status quo? How do you capture the voices, the insights, and also the concerns from those for whom the system has not served over time? And also be really clear about what your vision is in terms of this work. Why are you doing it? Why does it matter? And does it truly create more equitable learning opportunities for our children? And if so, how are we going to do that together?
And the summary here is, if we need to tell a good story, both in our internal school, in our larger community, potentially within our system, or even the region, we've got to tell a good story means we have to have a good plot. And how you establish your plot is by having a problem and a solution. You demonstrate what you did, you demonstrate what happened, and then where you're going to go next. To do that well, you got to gather data. So if you're going to do this, and we all hope you do, because we're starting to do it with our partners in the field too, capture where you are when you started, capture what you're doing when you're doing it, capture the effects and what's happening, and then continuously improve in that model and connect with others who are doing the same work. The more we share, the more we talk about the story, the more we have data to back up some of our decisions, the more likely we're going to get uptake in the field and start to actually make this a movement-centered, at the level of achievement of a movement instead of just localized pockets of hope.
And I'm seeing in the chat box, if the slide deck isn't available, you can email Eric or I, contact us via social media, and we'll make sure we get it to you, okay? One piece that we're sharing is a draft document that we have at KnowledgeWorks that focuses on agency. And the reason we share this, and this is a whole other topic that we didn't address here, but we believe that if you empower and inspire kids to leverage their voice in ways that drive to deeper learning, the idea of tracking is no longer an item, right? Where learners take greater ownership and control of their learning experience and their evidence of learning. Imagine the possibilities, right? We're now talking about flexible, not just pathways, but pathways that are created and inspired by the learner themselves. And so this is just a tool that we use internally to help us consider, are we seeing that agency thrive in the learning communities that we're supporting, whether it's an individual building or across an entire region or state? And so a tool that we didn't get to a ton today, but one that we believe if we're going to do personalized competency-based learning really well, we have to lean on the voices and the experiences of our kids, as well as the educators who serve and support them. All right, we talked very, very fast, and so sorry about the oh geez, what are those folks, auctioneer kind of type voice, but what comes to mind for you? Just open focus or commentary. You can open up to the whole group.
And feel free to use the chat too.
Can you suggest some of your favorite resources on these topics?
Yeah, the scholarship of Daniel Lozen is really compelling. The scholarship, of course, of Jeannie Oakes and her 2 books on detracking over the years have been sort of the cornerstones in that. Beth Rubin has published some really great pieces in Teachers College Record and Theory into Practice that really looks at the rationale behind it. Kevin Wellner, who I believe is at either Denver or Boulder, he has some fantastic scholarship about the actual approaches to the politics of detracking and what that looks like on the ground. And
He's
then
at Boulder.
He's at Boulder, yeah. And then part of the resources around the field, there are so many schools now that have really powerful CBE systems in place. And I think that's some of the best resources we can find, is to tap into the experiences that folks have had there when they've no longer needed the rationale for tracking. Once they've created really great systems, that, cast down your buckets in your neighbors where people who are doing this work. There's likely already a fervent and fertile discussion about these things that with expertise galore.
And thanks for completing the survey. And as you're completing that survey, just building on Eric's commentary, Elliot, thanks for sharing the work of some of our learning communities here in the chat, also Competency-Works. And as was listed also, the Students at the Center Hub.org is a great resource that captures a lot of the research that's been done over the years, but also captures the journey of many learning communities that have made this commitment as well. So truly appreciate you all. Thanks for joining us and sharing your insights in the breakouts and in the chat box, and truly appreciate you completing the survey so we can learn and continue to grow in our presentations as well. Thanks so much all.
Thanks everyone. Please reach out.
Thank you for leading with purpose. Thanks all.